Today on the show, we will be examining Paul and Josephus' reference to James, the brother of the Lord, and whether or not this defeats the theory of Jesus mythicism. My name is Haden Clark, and this is Help Me Believe. Well, welcome back, everyone. So glad to have you with me. Hope you're doing okay, and I hope you're staying safe during this pandemic and this time of great uncertainty. I really hope everyone is doing okay out there, and I'm glad to have you with me. Before getting into the show, I want to say thank you to our patron supporters. Thanks so much for your support. Because of your support, I get to produce free material like this for the interwebs. Thanks so much. You too can become a supporter by going to the Patreon link in the description below and becoming a donor. But today I want to look at, or want to return to this topic of Jesus mythicism that I've been doing a bit of a mini-series on, I suppose you could say. I'm kind of putting a playlist together of my responses to certain mythicists' positions and things like that. Today we're going to be looking at James, the brother of the Lord. And obviously if Jesus had a biological brother, that would mean he's not a celestial being, but a human being that lived here on earth because he had biological siblings. But just to give an overcap real quick, Jesus mythicism is the belief that Jesus was a celestial being and not, or angelic being, not a human being that lived here on earth, and so he was not a historical figure. And one premise of the mythicist argument that I think carries almost all the weight is that Paul himself, who is our earliest source of Christian writing, did not believe in a historical Jesus, or at least makes no reference to a historical Jesus, only a celestial Jesus. And that is the point that I have been trying to argue against over and over in this series that I've been doing. So we've critiqued this claim so far on two different grounds. The first one being that in the tradition of the Last Supper that Paul passes on in 1 Corinthians 11:23 through 26, and I'm just calling it the Last Supper for the sake of ease. Give me a break. I'm not trying to read Mark back into 1 Corinthians or whatever. But in this tradition found in 1 Corinthians 11:23 through 26, that Paul is referencing a human being, Jesus, who this event took place here on earth, and you can go back and watch the video to see why. And then secondly, I tried to establish that there was no good reason to assume that 1 Thessalonians 2, verses 13 through 16, is a later interpolation, and in fact that it was authentic to Paul, or original to Paul himself. And in those verses we find Paul referencing Jesus being killed by the Jews in Judea at that time, which would directly contradict the mythicist assertion that celestial Jesus was crucified in outer space. But today we will try to show that Jesus had a flesh and blood, earthly, historical, however you want to word that, brother, and other siblings as well, but specifically a brother named James. And this would be something that could not be true if in fact Jesus was simply believed by Paul to be a celestial being. And so we are going to examine Paul's reference to James, the brother of the Lord, as well as Josephus' reference to James, the brother of Jesus. But let's start with Paul. So in Paul's letter to the Galatians, he begins by addressing challenges to his authority as an apostle. And apparently the church that Paul had planted in Galatia had been visited by certain people from Jerusalem who were effectively saying that Paul's authority was inferior to the apostles in Jerusalem, or something like that. And so in response, Paul reminds the Galatians that he did not receive the gospel from flesh and blood, but received it via revelation from the risen Jesus himself. And in his recounting of his own conversion and testimony, Paul is forced to admit that he did in fact spend some time in Jerusalem with Cephas, that's Peter, and James, the brother of the Lord. And that's where the reference comes. Now, what's interesting and what makes this account, Paul's account here, more plausibly true than false, is that it would actually directly undermine Paul's argument that he did not receive, that he should be considered on par with the rest of the apostles because he received the gospel not from flesh and blood, but from Jesus himself, the risen Jesus himself, via divine revelation. And what I mean by that is that if Paul spent time in Jerusalem with Peter and James, then obviously they would have been talking about more than just the weather, as one clever commentator says. They certainly would have talked about Jesus, and Paul would have received traditions from Cephas, Peter, and James themselves. And so again, Paul's trying to make the argument that he did not receive the gospel from any people here on earth, but he received it in a revelation from Jesus. And then he immediately says that he did in fact spend some time with the original apostles, Cephas and the brother of Jesus, James. And so the mere mention of that is kind of like an embarrassing detail. It's not embarrassing, but it directly undermines the argument that Paul's trying to make. In other words, Paul shares this detail, him meeting Cephas and James, at the expense of his own assertion that he received the gospel via revelation and not human tradition. So it's more plausibly true than false that Paul was in fact acquainted with Peter and James. Even Richard Carrier, the popular Jesus mythicist, assigns Paul's claim here, his claim to have met Peter and James, in favor of historicity. In other words, he thinks it's more plausibly true than false as well. Robert Price says that this is the strongest piece of evidence in favor of historicity of Jesus, that is, if in fact this is his brother. What is of primary importance for us today is Paul's description of this James that he met in Jerusalem. He refers to James as, quote, the Lord's brother, or the brother of the Lord. And the passing observer will immediately read this description and just think, oh, James was Jesus' sibling. But no, says the mythicist. That is reading historicity back into the text. After all, it was very common for Paul to refer to Christians in general as brothers or brothers in Christ. This does not entail that they were biological siblings of Jesus, obviously. And so this is just a common appellation for all Christians. You know, like when people used to call me Brother Haden when I was a youth pastor. And to be honest, I always insisted that people just call me Haden because the appellation of brother, while I know it was meant with adoration, was always a bit strange to me. So please, I'm not Brother Haden. Just call me Haden. Now, it is true that Paul uses the appellation of brother or brethren throughout his letters to refer to Christians in general. For example, in 1 Corinthians 1:1, he says Sosthenes, our brother. Also, in 2 Corinthians 1:1, he says Timothy, our brother, or Quartus, the brother, in Romans 16:23. And elsewhere he uses the plural form, and he does it quite often, the plural form being brethren. The problem with applying this understanding here in Galatians 1:19 is that this is the only place we see the formulation, the brother of the Lord. The only similar formulation is found in 1 Corinthians 9:3-6, where Paul mentions the apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas. Now, the interesting thing that you'll probably notice immediately about 1 Corinthians 9:3-6 is that you see the same distinctions between the apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas, just like in Galatians 1. And this is the problem with understanding the appellation brother as merely referencing the fact that they were a part of the same Christian family at large. These brothers of the Lord are referenced as distinct from the apostles and Cephas, that is, Peter himself. The obvious question is, are Peter and the other apostles not brothers of the Lord in the more general sense? Of course they are. Paul cannot have this understanding in mind unless he thinks that Peter and the other apostles do not belong to the Christian family at large, and that would obviously be absurd. The easiest explanation is that these brothers of the Lord, which include James, are distinct from Cephas and other believers like the other apostles because they are Jesus' literal biological brothers. This also happens to be the overwhelming consensus understanding for the aforementioned reasons. And this is also the understanding that subsequent generations of Christians had in the early church. This tradition persisted throughout church history despite its obvious awkwardness. How could the pre-existent Son of God have biological siblings? And yet that is exactly what all the early Christians believed. And when we turn to the Gospels, specifically Mark's Gospel, we see that Jesus in fact had multiple siblings. You see that in Mark 6, verses 1-4. And one of them was named James. Now this fits well with what we see in Paul. We see James as a biological brother of Jesus in both Paul and Mark. There simply is no grounds for asserting that Mark historicized Jesus by giving him biological brothers. Jesus having biological brothers goes back to Paul as well. Another attempt at sidestepping all of this is by Richard Carrier, who in typical fashion just asserts that this reference to the brothers of the Lord is a reference to a category of believers that are sub-apostolic. That is, they are below the apostles. So this category of people named brothers of the Lord is just a reference to people who are below the apostles, or they're just general, regular, everyday Christians in general. Paul's argument then becomes, if even regular Christians are being supported by their communities, surely Paul should be too. The problem with this contrived explanation is that Paul's argument actually depends on all the people he mentions, Cephas, James, and the other apostles, as having apostolic status. Paul is making the argument that he should be considered an apostle as well. So if the brothers of the Lord does not refer to someone of apostolic status, then Paul's argument completely falls apart. How someone like Carrier can miss this boggles the mind. So Paul is unequivocally referencing James as a literal biological brother of Jesus. This simple fact brings down the house of cards known as Jesus mythicism. Jesus was not some celestial being in outer space. He had biological earthly siblings, and one of them was named James. Now, this fact is also bolstered by its attestation outside of Christian writings. We find James, the brother of Jesus, mentioned in Josephus in the Antiquities of the Jews, Book 20, Chapter 9, right there in Section 1. Now I'm going to read this rather lengthy passage real quick. It says, "When, therefore, Ananias was, I don't know how to pronounce names, was of this disposition, he thought he had now a proper opportunity to exercise his authority. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was also called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. But as for those who seemed the most equitable of the citizens, and such as were the most uneasy at the breach of the laws, they disliked what was done. They also sent to the king, Agrippa, desiring him to send to Ananias, that he should act so no more, for that what he had already done was not to be justified. Nay, some of them went also to meet Albinus, as he was upon his journey from Alexandria, and informed him that it was not lawful for Ananias to assemble a Sanhedrin without his consent. Whereupon Albinus compiled with what they said, and wrote in anger to Ananias, and threatened that he would bring them to punishment for what he had done. On which King Agrippa took the high priesthood from him when he had ruled but 3 months, and made Jesus, the son of Damnius, high priest." Unlike another passage from Josephus known as the Testimonium Flavianum, this passage is not hotly debated, and is almost universally recognized as authentic. This passage has added weight considering that Josephus was a younger contemporary of this supposed James, being about 25 years old whenever these events would have taken place. Josephus was also a resident of Jerusalem, and the place where this event took place, and this population was roughly in the upper tens of thousands. It's not unlikely that a historian like Josephus would have had access to gaining this sort of knowledge, or the knowledge of the events that he's describing. That this is just a passing reference also bolsters its authenticity. And there is absolutely no apologetic value in saying Jesus was called the Christ, as you see here in this passage. A later Christian interpolator would have simply said that Jesus was the Christ, not that he was called the Christ. If this were an interpolation, the only value that it would afford is that Jesus was a historical figure. But of course, there were no Jesus mythicists at this time, so why interpolate a passage to argue against a position that did not exist? Unlike the Testimonium passage, this passage affords no theological or apologetic value and would be a senseless interpolation. The easiest understanding is that Josephus makes a passing, oblique reference to James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, because that's what he was called and he really existed. So what is a mythicist to do? They obviously cannot accept this passage as authentic, or their house of cards comes crashing down. Well, enter Richard Carrier. Probably because of the numerous lines of evidence just mentioned, Carrier only tries to say that the appellation, who was called Messiah, or Christ, was interpolated, and not the entire passage. The upshot is this. The appellation of Jesus being who was called Messiah, or Christ, was not in the original document, but a scribe made the note in the margins of the document that he was called the Christ, and a later scribe took the marginal note to be a correction and added it into the document. Therefore, and then all the previous ones went out of existence, and we only have access to this new interpolated passage. Therefore, the original reading would identify Jesus, who had a brother named James, with Jesus, the son of Damnius, later mentioned in the passage. That's why I read the entire lengthy passage. So what evidence does Carrier offer to support his assertion that a scribe would make this sort of marginal note? Well, God only knows. He merely asserts it and moves on quite quickly. No surprise there. He explores no alternatives, he just simply asserts it. But surely the fact that the appellation agrees grammatically with the rest of the passage would damn Carrier's assertion from the get-go, but he doesn't even explore this. He does try to support his claim by saying that the brief description of Jesus as being called the Messiah would surely have sparked a digression and further explanation if it were in fact original to Josephus. But why should we suspect this? Well, you won't be surprised to find that Carrier gives absolutely no support for why we should expect this. But let's do Carrier's homework for him since he's not going to explain. So elsewhere in Josephus, Josephus uses this verb called in exactly the same way he does here in this passage. Josephus uses this verb to describe a place called eminence in the Antiquities in Book 9. He uses it to describe 10 men who were called the freemen in Antiquities Book 14. In another place, a place called Union in his autobiography. In all of these examples, Josephus mentions what people and places were called in a passing reference with no further digression. What's even more, and astounding that Carrier makes no reference to it, is that in this exact same book that Jesus is mentioned, Josephus mentions a Joseph who was called Cabai, if I'm pronouncing that right, in a passing reference with no further explanation. Carrier's bold assertion that we should expect further explanation if in fact the reference to Jesus who was called the Messiah was authentic to Josephus is falsified by reading Josephus himself and in fact reading the very same book that this reference to Jesus is found in. But if all that isn't enough, perhaps the most damning evidence of all to Carrier's assertion is the way in which Josephus references people that he names on multiple occasions. Remember that Carrier's assertion is that the reference to Jesus as the brother of James is the same Jesus as Jesus the son of Damnius, later mentioned in the passage. So when Josephus names someone for the first time, he uses an appellation like the ones we have seen, so as to distinguish the person from other people with the exact same name. This functions much like a last name functions in our own day. But after introducing the reader to a specific person, if Josephus mentions their name again later in close proximity, he leaves out the appellation. So for example, Josephus might say, and there was a certain Haden who was called the idiot, and he lived in Texas, etc., etc., etc. Now, if he were to refer to my name once again, he would simply say Haden, without the appellation, who was called an idiot. And this makes perfect sense. Why use the appellation twice? He just distinguished me from any other Hadens. There's no reason to do it again a second time just a few sentences later. The reader would not be confused as to which Haden he was referencing because he literally just made it clear. And I didn't cite any specific examples because Josephus literally does this every single time he references someone. So just read Josephus and you'll see it over and over again. The reason this is important is this. Carrier wants us to believe that Jesus is mentioned first, either without an appellation or I suppose with the same appellation of the later mentioned Jesus, son of Damnius. Either way, this would break Josephus' firmly established pattern for referencing people in his works. If in the first mention of Jesus there was no appellation, this means Josephus only mentions the appellation in his second reference to Jesus, something Josephus doesn't do anywhere else in his writing. If in the first reference to Jesus there was originally the appellation son of Damnius, this would mean that Josephus mentions the appellation in both his first reference to Jesus and in his second reference to Jesus, with no other Jesuses in between, something Josephus does not do anywhere else. As we mentioned, why would you use the appellation twice in a row if there were no other Jesuses to be confused with? Carrier's hypothesis falls apart, just like his mythicist hypothesis. If, however, the first reference to Jesus was who was called the Christ, then the Josephus pattern is maintained. The reason we find the appellation son of Damnius in the second reference to a Jesus in this passage is to distinguish this Jesus from the previously mentioned Jesus who had a brother named James. And so what we are stuck with is a contemporary, Josephus, who lived in Jerusalem and who knew of a certain James that had a certain brother named Jesus, and this Jesus was also known as the one who was called the Messiah. This also fits exactly with what we find in Paul. The mythicist position completely falls apart and is nothing more and nothing less than an attempt to rewrite history so as to better fit one's preferred outcome. This is an endeavor that should always be met with a hyperskepticism. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, leave us a review, and of course you can follow the Patreon link in the description to become a supporter of the show and get access to our bonus segment as well as other exclusive content like that. Thanks so much for joining me, guys, and we'll see you next time.